The Battle of Okehazama, 1560. Oda Nobunaga led roughly 2,500 men straight into the path of an army 10 times larger, commanded by Imagawa Yoshimoto, and ended the campaign in a matter of hours. The Imagawa army was not marching. It was resting, drinking, celebrating what it believed was an inevitable victory. And Nobunaga chose that exact moment to attack the enemy's command center head-on. By conventional military logic, this decision should never have existed. A minor warlord abandoning defensive positions, advancing into open ground, and striking a vastly superior force was not bold. It was irrational. And yet, the result rewrote the balance of power in central Japan. Why did Imagawa Yoshimoto, commanding one of the strongest armies of the Sengoku period, fail to react in time? Why did a single storm, a narrow valley, and a fractured moment inside a military camp matter more than numbers, armor, and reputation? And most unsettling of all, was this victory the product of strategic genius, or a gamble that survived only because the enemy collapsed at the worst possible second? Because Okehazama was not won by superior force. It was won by betting everything on a fragile assumption about how power behaves when it feels safe. This episode is not about a surprise attack. It is about a commander who deliberately designed a strategy that would fail instantly if even one variable shifted. And in the sections ahead, we will dismantle the logic behind that decision, examine the risks that nearly destroyed it, and confront the cost that history often ignores. The strategic problem at Okehazama was not how to win a battle. It was how to survive relevance. Oda Nobunaga was not facing annihilation because Imagawa Yoshimoto was tactically superior. He was facing annihilation because the balance of power had already decided the outcome in advance. Imagawa's army was larger, better supplied, politically legitimized, and moving with momentum. If Nobunaga followed the expected path, delay, fortify, negotiate, retreat, he would not lose immediately. He would dissolve slowly. This is the trap that rarely appears in traditional military narratives. Sometimes the most dangerous moment is not when defeat is imminent, but when survival leads only to irrelevance. For Nobunaga, conventional defense meant being absorbed, sidelined, or erased later under more controlled conditions. That is why this strategy was fundamentally unorthodox. Not because it was clever, but because it rejected safety as a valid objective. Nobunaga was not trying to hold ground. He was trying to collapse an entire campaign by attacking the one component that could not absorb shock, the command structure itself. The real question, then, is not why he attacked. It is why he believed the Imagawa command would be psychologically and structurally unprepared for an attack that logic said would never come. And to understand that, we need to step back and examine the strategic landscape that made such a decision appear insane, and yet necessary. To understand why Okehazama was possible, we have to understand why it should not have been. In 1560, the strategic map of central Japan appeared stable. Imagawa Yoshimoto commanded a coalition force estimated at over 20,000 men. He controlled Suruga, Tatami, and Mikawa, 3 provinces tied together by logistics, political legitimacy, and momentum. His campaign toward Kyoto was not speculative. It was procedural. Each small domain in his path was expected to submit or be removed. Oda Nobunaga stood in the way with a fraction of that power. Owari was fragmented. Nobunaga's authority over his own retainers was still contested. His army was smaller, less prestigious, and operating under constant internal pressure. In purely material terms, this was not a contest. It was an absorption process. The objective mismatch is critical here. Imagawa's true goal was not to destroy Oda Nobunaga. It was to pass through Owari with minimal disruption and continue east toward Kyoto. Oda was a problem to be managed, not a threat to be feared. This asymmetry created the first structural vulnerability. When one side treats a campaign as existential and the other treats it as administrative, risk perception diverges. Imagawa needed stability. Nobunaga needed rupture. Now consider the constraints that framed both sides. Geography limited maneuver options. Owari was cut by narrow valleys, forested ridges, and irregular roads that slowed large formations. For a massive army, this meant dispersion and delay. For a small force, it meant concealment and speed. Time was also working unevenly. Every day that passed strengthened Imagawa's legitimacy and weakened Nobunaga's internal cohesion. Delay favored the invader. Politically, Imagawa carried prestige. His banner projected inevitability. Nobunaga carried uncertainty. His authority depended on perception, not force. And perception is fragile. This leads to the most important element of the strategic map, psychological posture. Imagawa's army was not deployed for combat. It was encamped. Resting. Celebrating minor victories along the route. Command focus had shifted from vigilance to administration. This is not negligence in the moral sense. It is a predictable byproduct of overwhelming advantage. When a force believes defeat is statistically impossible, it reallocates attention. Security becomes routine. Signals are filtered. Warnings require stronger evidence to be believed. That was the blind spot. On the Oda side, the blind spot was inverted. Nobunaga's greatest risk was not detection. It was paralysis. His retainers understood the numbers. They understood the odds. They understood that an offensive move violated every instinct of survival. Which means the greatest friction inside the Oda camp was not logistical. It was psychological compliance. The strategic map at Okehazama was therefore not defined by troop movements. It was defined by mismatched assumptions. Imagawa assumed no one would attack. Nobunaga assumed survival required doing exactly that. Everything that followed emerged from this imbalance. And inside these constraints, geographic, political, psychological, a decision began to form that would openly reject the logic of safety. Every military culture carries an invisible rulebook. In Sengoku Japan, that rulebook was brutally pragmatic. When outnumbered, you did not seek battle. You fortified. You delayed. You conserved strength. You waited for weather, politics, or allies to change the equation. For a minor daimyo like Oda Nobunaga, the correct response to Imagawa's advance was clear. Hold defensible positions. Protect castles. Force the enemy to spend time and resources. Turn a fast campaign into a slow one. On paper, this doctrine made sense. Imagawa's army was large, but large armies bleed through delay. Extended supply lines create friction. Internal discipline weakens over time. A patient defender can survive long enough for the strategic environment to shift. But this doctrine relied on an assumption that did not apply at Okehazama. It assumed time was neutral. For Nobunaga, time was hostile. Every additional day reinforced the narrative that Imagawa's victory was inevitable. Every delay weakened Nobunaga's authority over his own retainers. In Sengoku Japan, loyalty was conditional. Men followed momentum, not sympathy. Defensive doctrine also assumed political space. That a weaker lord could afford to appear cautious without being perceived as weak. Nobunaga did not have that luxury. If he withdrew behind walls, he would signal submission in everything but name. Imagawa did not need to storm Owari. He could wait. Local elites would defect on their own. This is the core reason doctrine failed here. It optimized for survival of forces, not survival of legitimacy. There is another failure, less discussed. Doctrine assumed rational enemy behavior. Imagawa's command structure was built for campaigns, not ambushes. Security routines were designed to repel resistance, not anticipate irrational aggression. No doctrine prepares a large force for a smaller one that abandons preservation entirely. In fact, doctrine punishes such behavior. A commander who proposes a direct assault against a tenfold superior force is removed, not rewarded. The system is designed to eliminate this kind of thinking. Which creates a paradox. When doctrine filters out unreasonable options, it also blinds an army to the possibility that an enemy might choose them anyway. Nobunaga understood this instinctively. He was not fighting Imagawa's soldiers. He was fighting Imagawa's assumptions. If he followed doctrine, he would lose without a decisive moment. If he broke doctrine, he might lose instantly. But there was one scenario doctrine could not handle. A strike so illogical that the enemy's decision-making loop failed to activate in time. That is the space Nobunaga chose to operate in. And once that decision was made, the next question became far more dangerous: how does a strategy built on fragility actually come into existence? This decision did not emerge from confidence. It emerged from compression. Inside Nobunaga's camp, the strategic space was collapsing. Options were disappearing faster than they could be debated. Every conventional path led to the same end state: gradual political suffocation. The proposal to strike Imagawa's command was not presented as an elegant plan. It was presented as the only move that still contained agency. Resistance came immediately. Senior retainers understood what this meant. A frontal advance against a vastly superior force violated not just tactics, but social order. Failure would not be explained as miscalculation. It would be explained as recklessness. This is where the first hidden assumption enters. Nobunaga assumed that fear could be managed if the objective was narrow enough. He was not asking his men to defeat an army. He was asking them to reach a place. A single point. A single moment. This reframing mattered. A battle could not be imagined. A strike could. The second assumption was more dangerous. He assumed that Imagawa Yoshimoto's presence inside the camp created rigidity, not strength. Large armies orbit their commanders. When the commander is stationary, the system becomes centralized. Information flows inward. Decisions flow outward slowly. Nobunaga was not targeting a man. He was targeting a bottleneck. The third assumption was the most fragile of all. He assumed that Imagawa's army was not mentally deployed. Not unprepared in a technical sense. Unprepared in a psychological one. Victory had already been internalized. Alertness had been traded for ceremony. Security had become routine. This assumption could not be tested. It could only be believed. The internal debate did not resolve this risk. It absorbed it. Nobunaga's authority at this stage was not absolute. He could not convince everyone. He could only compel motion. And here lies the critical shift. Once the decision was made, retreat ceased to exist as an option. Not tactically. Psychologically. A strategy built on fragility cannot survive hesitation. If doubt spreads, the entire structure collapses before contact. This is why Nobunaga did not leave room for consensus. Consensus slows. Silence moves. The decision was therefore not refined until it was safe. It was executed while it was still dangerous. And that choice leads directly to the most unstable phase of all, translating a theoretical gamble into a real-world operation where every minor variable could end it instantly. On paper, the strategy was simple. In reality, it was structurally unstable. A small force would move fast, stay hidden, and strike the enemy's command location before the surrounding army could react. There was no margin for delay. No depth to absorb error. No fallback position. Every component of the plan depended on compression. Movement had to be silent. Routes had to remain unseen. Timing had to align not just with distance, but with behavior inside the Imagawa camp. This is where strategy leaves theory and enters physics. Nobunaga's force could not move like an army. Armies announce themselves. They carry weight, noise, and logistics. Instead, this force moved like a temporary distortion in the terrain. Equipment was minimized. Formation was loose. Command was decentralized just enough to allow speed, but not enough to lose cohesion. This created the first operational risk. Loose formations increase survivability during movement, but they degrade control at the moment of contact. If the strike fragmented on approach, there would be no second chance. The second risk was detection. Large armies are not blind, but they are slow to interpret anomalies. A few scouts missing. A sound dismissed as weather. Movement assumed to be local civilians. The strategy relied on these signals being misclassified. This is not chance. It is pattern exploitation. Imagawa's camp was not expecting an attack. Therefore, any signal suggesting one had to overcome institutional disbelief before action could follow. That delay window was the entire plan. Then came the weather. The storm was not merely cover. It was a sensory disruption. Rain flattened sound. Wind erased directionality. Visibility collapsed into fragments. But storms are indifferent allies. They do not wait. They do not synchronize. If the storm shifted early, movement would be exposed. If it lingered too long, timing inside the camp would change. If it weakened, the force would emerge without concealment. This was the most dangerous dependency. At this point, the plan had already passed the point of return. The approach route itself introduced another layer of risk. Narrow terrain protects against detection, but it also traps movement. If intercepted, retreat would not be possible in formation. Collapse would be immediate. This is where the true nature of the gamble becomes clear. The plan did not fail gradually. It was binary. Either the force reached the command area intact and fast enough to disrupt decision-making, or it ceased to exist as a fighting unit. There was no prolonged engagement scenario. Inside the Imagawa camp, meanwhile, reality was drifting away from readiness. Security existed, but it was passive. Guards were present, but not oriented toward threat recognition. Command staff were occupied with administration, not anticipation. This is a subtle but critical distinction. An army prepared for battle distributes attention outward. An army at rest pulls attention inward. Nobunaga's force was not fighting soldiers. It was racing against the enemy's internal reaction time. The moment of contact was not a clash of formations. It was a rupture. Confusion preceded resistance. Orders lagged behind noise. Chain of command tried to activate under conditions it was not configured to handle. And this is where the first microcollapse nearly occurred. Identification. In chaos, recognition becomes lethal. Small units risk being mistaken for friendly elements. Momentum can stall in hesitation. The strike only survives if violence is immediate and directional. Any pause invites containment. This is where leadership at the tactical edge mattered. Nobunaga's presence, or at least the clarity of intent transmitted downward, prevented hesitation. The objective was not territory. Not attrition. It was termination of command function. Once that function fractured, the surrounding force lost coherence faster than numbers could compensate. But even here, the plan was seconds from failure. Had Yoshimoto relocated moments earlier, the strike would have decapitated nothing. Had a reserve unit reacted autonomously, containment could have formed. Had communication lines held even briefly, the window would close. Execution did not succeed because it was flawless. It succeeded because the enemy's system was structurally unable to recover fast enough from shock. And that brings us to the most revealing phase of the campaign. How did a vastly superior force receive these signals, and still respond in exactly the wrong way? Large armies do not fail because they lack strength. They fail because their decision-making systems are slow, filtered, and biased toward expectation. At Okehazama, the Imagawa command did not ignore warning signs. It misinterpreted them. This distinction matters. Noise reached the camp in fragments. Unclear reports. Sudden movement. Sounds that did not fit a known pattern. But these signals collided with a dominant assumption: no rational enemy would attack. When assumptions are strong, information must be overwhelming to override them. What Imagawa received was not overwhelming. It was ambiguous. Ambiguity is lethal to centralized command. Reports moved upward. Each layer softened urgency. Each officer recalibrated risk based on doctrine and probability. The structure did exactly what it was designed to do: filter out unlikely threats. This is the first point of failure. Imagawa's command system required confirmation before action. Confirmation required time. Time was the resource Nobunaga was consuming. When resistance finally formed, it was local and uncoordinated. Individual units reacted, but without shared orientation. There was no synchronized countermovement. The second failure was doctrinal. Imagawa's army was structured to repel frontal resistance. Perimeter defense assumed external pressure. It did not anticipate internal rupture. When the command area was breached, the system had no rapid reconfiguration protocol. There was no script for command compromised. This is where superiority becomes paralysis. Units waited for orders that never arrived. Subcommanders hesitated to act independently. Initiative was suppressed by hierarchy. And hierarchy collapses fastest when its apex disappears. The death of Yoshimoto was not symbolically decisive. It was mechanically decisive. Orders stopped. Certainty evaporated. The army did not know whether it was losing, reorganizing, or transitioning. In that vacuum, rumors traveled faster than commands. This is the third failure. Psychological contagion. A large force at rest has poor emotional inertia. Shock spreads faster than discipline. Fear multiplies because individuals do not know where authority has gone. Small groups began to withdraw. Others stood still. Some attempted resistance without coordination. Each action contradicted the next. What should have been a containment response became fragmentation. From the outside, this looks like chaos. From a systems perspective, it is predictable. When a force is optimized for control rather than adaptation, it cannot absorb surprise. It breaks. The tragedy for Imagawa is that even partial adaptation might have been enough. A rapid rally point. A delegated counterstrike. A commander with authority to act without confirmation. But none of these mechanisms were active. Not because of incompetence. Because the structure had never needed them. This is the cruel irony of overwhelming power. It trains you for the expected, and blinds you to the impossible. By the time the Imagawa army understood what was happening, the campaign was already lost. Not tactically. Structurally. And yet, victory did not come without cost, nor did it guarantee the future. The immediate outcome of Okehazama was clear. Imagawa Yoshimoto was dead. His army disintegrated. A campaign that had appeared inevitable collapsed in a single afternoon. But strategic outcomes are not the same as strategic profits. Nobunaga did not defeat the Imagawa army in the conventional sense. He shattered its coherence. The difference matters. The collapse was not uniform. Units withdrew in confusion. Allied lords recalculated loyalties. Momentum reversed faster than it had been built. For Nobunaga, the victory created space. Political oxygen. Legitimacy through shock. But this space was narrow and unstable. The first cost was human. This type of operation concentrates risk onto a small number of people. The strike force absorbed danger that would normally be distributed across an army. Casualties, even if numerically limited, were existential. There were no reserves to replace them. Losses inside the Imagawa camp were magnified by panic. Men died not only from violence, but from disorganization. Retreat routes collapsed. Coordination failed. These are the deaths history counts poorly. The second cost was psychological. For Nobunaga's retainers, survival reinforced belief, but also fear. They had crossed a line. They now followed a leader willing to gamble their lives on assumptions, not certainty. This creates loyalty, but it also creates tension. Every future campaign would be judged against this precedent. Every delay would feel like hesitation. Every cautious move would feel like betrayal of identity. Nobunaga had defined himself as a commander who breaks rules. That identity is difficult to sustain without escalation. The third cost was strategic rigidity of a different kind. Success narrowed perception. The lesson that boldness works is seductive and dangerous. It risks turning context-specific success into generalized doctrine. Okehazama worked because of precise alignment. Enemy psychology, command structure, weather, timing, and internal pressure. Remove one element, and the strategy collapses. This is the hidden price of myth. Finally, there is the cost history rarely acknowledges. If this strike had failed, Nobunaga would not be remembered as reckless. He would be remembered as irrelevant. His lineage would vanish quietly. There would be no record of the idea, only the result. Victory preserved the narrative. Failure would have erased it. This asymmetry distorts how we interpret the past. We study Okehazama because it worked. But its logic is inseparable from its fragility. And that raises the final question this campaign forces us to confront: what, exactly, does Okehazama teach us about strategy, and what does it dangerously tempt us to misunderstand? Okehazama is often remembered as a lesson in audacity. That is the shallow reading. At its core, this campaign is not about bravery, speed, or surprise. It is about strategic asymmetry and risk acceptance. Oda Nobunaga did not win because he was stronger. He won because he was willing to operate in a risk space his opponent could not mentally enter. The decisive factor was not the storm, not the terrain, not even the assassination of Imagawa Yoshimoto. The decisive factor was the collapse of Imagawa's decision loop. Imagawa's system was optimized for continuity. It assumed threats would be proportional, predictable, and externally visible. Nobunaga violated all three assumptions at once. This is the first principle Okehazama reveals. When a system filters out unreasonable actions, it becomes blind to adversaries who abandon self-preservation as a constraint. Doctrine does not fail because it is wrong. It fails because it excludes outliers by design. The second principle is more uncomfortable. Unorthodox strategies are not superior strategies. They are fragile strategies that exploit rigidity elsewhere. Okehazama worked because Imagawa's command structure was centralized, ceremonial, and psychologically relaxed. Against a more decentralized force, or one already conditioned for internal rupture, the same move would have resulted in annihilation. This matters because it limits what can be learned. You cannot copy Okehazama. You can only recognize the conditions that made it possible. The third principle concerns leadership under compression. Nobunaga's decision was not made in a vacuum of options. It was made because every conventional path led to slow extinction. This is a pattern that repeats across history. Unorthodox strategies often emerge not from creativity, but from strategic suffocation. When survival within the rules guarantees irrelevance, leaders either break the rules, or disappear quietly. This reframes the question of genius. Was Nobunaga a visionary? Or was he a commander forced into a narrow corridor where irrationality became the only rational move? The answer is not binary. Okehazama was not a miracle. It was a calculated intrusion into the enemy's cognitive blind spot. But here is the final, dangerous temptation. History rewards outcomes, not reasoning. Because this gamble succeeded, it becomes instructive. Because it succeeded, it gains narrative authority. Yet most strategies built on this level of fragility fail. They fail without record, without myth, without lesson. Okehazama survives because it worked once. That does not make it safe. It makes it rare. The true lesson is not be bold. It is this: understand which assumptions your enemy cannot afford to question, and decide whether you can afford to bet everything on breaking them. And that is why Okehazama still unsettles military thinkers centuries later. Not because it shows how to win, but because it shows how thin the line is between strategic brilliance and total erasure. Okehazama did not change history by force of arms. It changed history by revealing how power collapses when certainty replaces vigilance. A small force did not defeat a large one. A rigid system failed to survive a single, implausible shock. This is why the battle resists comfortable interpretation. It refuses to become doctrine. It refuses to scale. And perhaps that is its final warning. Some strategies exist only once. They work only under precise conditions. And they demand a price that history remembers only when the gamble succeeds. In the next unusual campaign, we will examine another decision that broke every rule of its era, and nearly destroyed the command that authorized it. Not because it was foolish, but because the system behind it could not see its own limits. If you are ready, we move on.